Other-Terrestrial, Season 1, Episode 2, Vitriol, by Nolan Conray.
Computers now have primary control.
It felt like something was on the back of his neck. Jeb kept scratching at it, his rough gloves rubbing the skin raw, but there was nothing there to rub away. Moments after he stopped, he felt it again. It was the goddamned witch in the other room, he knew it. She'd done something to him, something that would only stop when the governor finally spaced the bitch. He wanted to be there to see it, but he was also terrified that she would curse them all with her last breath. Spacing a person killed them, sure, but didn't it kill their everlasting soul? They would just continue to be out in the dark, looking for a way back in. He'd always heard the stories of the monsters in the vacuum, of the angry and lost spirits of the killers and cannibals who'd been spaced. He'd never believed them, not truly believed them, until he'd seen the witch. With her strange eye that seemed to glow with its own light, to be an unnatural shade of violet when every camera failed to capture it, he was sure she was one of the curse-born. A baby whose soul had been replaced by one of the vengeful spirits of the dark that had slipped in and found a new body to inhabit. The door in front of him opened, and he snapped to attention. "Sir," Jeb barked, straightening as best he could. He was holding his rifle wrong, he realized, and fumbled to hold it properly. Governor T didn't chew him out, though, only staring at him with an intensity Jeb had never seen before. "Leave," the governor ordered. A dumbfounded expression went over his face. "Sir?" "I need to speak to the seer. Come back later." Yes, sir." His heart was pounding. Was the governor going to kill her now? Jeb wasn't sure why he felt so alarmed. He'd met the governor a dozen times. Well, at least been in the same room with him. But this time he felt terrified, and he couldn't even say why. His stomach was doing flips, and he wasn't even the one in danger. He just obeyed. Hell, if he was going to cross the man. That's how one got spaced, and more than dying in the dark, he feared those spirits that would come for him. Once Jeb was gone, the governor opened the door and stepped into the small cell block, opening the last door to see the seer's cell. He stood there, waiting for her to acknowledge him. "My God," she breathed. "You're real. No matter what shape I take, you can see what I truly am," Kel spoke. The woman was quiet for a long moment. She stepped closer. "All my life I've seen things in my dreams," she said, her voice soft. Carefully, slowly, she reached up a hand. "Things that called to me." Her hand jerked back as if she'd been burned. "Things in the dark. I never wanted them to be real." Kel's shape barely even registered to her, and the Shoggoth was not sure if the woman saw it all, or only saw what was beyond it. "I exist," Kel said. To her ears, it was not the voice of the governor, but a chorus of soft voices speaking together. "Why are you here?" Apollonia demanded. I'll be spaced soon. Couldn't you just take me then? She jerked her gaze away. Is it necessary to torture me more? I just wanted it to be peaceful before the end. It will never be peaceful for you, Kel said. But its voices lacked poison, and her gaze was drawn back to it. Not while I'm alive. It's why I want to stay here and die, she replied. Even then you will not know peace, Kel replied. Curiosity sparked it to speak again. What is it that you see that is so terrible? Something changed in the woman. The dark encroached on them, and even Kel felt stirrings in it that he had never encountered before. Strange formations that a human mind shouldn't be able to conceive, yet she was the cause of them existing, even if she did not realize it. Her hair seemed to meld smoothly into that darkness, and Kel could not tell where she ended and it began. I have seen an ocean of blood crashing, she spoke. Her voice had a new tenor, and Kel could see the shapes that ensued. Her words alone infected the underlying reality. Did she know? Did she know just what she was? Because Kel was unsure. Her voice came again, and reality blurred more in a way that Kel at once found foreign and familiar. I have seen lives beyond counting drowned in it. She seemed to deflate. The shadows became mundane once more, something Kel found curious. And I can't bear to see it, she finished. Your death does not mean they will die, Kel said. All things die. Except your kind, she replied. Bitterness crept into her voice. My kind are like the things of which you think, but they are not the same. We may not die easily, but we can die. Kel shook its head. There used to be so many more of us. I've never seen Earth, she said, correctly divining his origins. So I don't know. Perhaps one day you will, Kel replied. Her eyes narrowed. If I keep living. If you keep living, Kel repeated. A pall started to form between them, but Kel broke it. Do not choose to die here. You only need to say yes to Brooks. She closed her eyes and faced what may come. Yes, Kel replied. Her eyes opened, and in the violet glow, Kel saw a hole to depths of reality that even his kind had never ventured to. All right, she said. I will inform him. Kel turned to the door and left. Pyrrha jammed her sensor around the corner and staggered after it as it told her that the path ahead was clear. Her breathing was ragged, her muscles burned with pain, and she almost lost control of their movement. But she pressed on. Had they not been in zero-G, she could never have moved Sens. The large rocky parts of his body probably weighed hundreds of kilograms alone. The guard had not shot her, and she found herself wishing he had. At least she could have stopped her own bleeding, assuming she'd survived. But the man had shot Sens instead. Her return shot had taken him in the armpit. He'd turned and presented it too much. Why he'd even done it, she couldn't know, but he'd spat blood at her as he'd been dying. Fucking Xenos, he'd said. Tears had been in his eyes. His death was senseless, pointless, and Sens might soon follow. She'd taken him through a series of narrow, winding tunnels, barely large enough for her to fit them both through. It had been exhausting, but with the information she'd gotten from the guard system, she found that it significantly shortened their path back to the ship. The effort, though, had not just been exhausting, but she was pretty sure she'd strained a few muscles. Not to mention the injuries from when he'd crashed into her. All her own fault, of course. She'd been trying to keep him from crashing into a bulkhead, but she'd never had to transport a victim who was made of stone. Sens, you awake? She asked loudly, hoping to get any response. Since the guard's bullet had ripped through his side, the coral had been unresponsive. The water trapped in his inner suit was gone, and she could tell that his body was drying out quickly. The rough rock had a huge gap in its side, a whole chunk blasted away. Angry red filaments penetrated out of it, but had quickly curled up back into the rock. Other than that, it only looked like rock. Paler inside than out, but that was all. Was he alive or dead? She didn't know, and the data sets she had on her system didn't tell her any more. Anatomical and medical knowledge about his people was minimum in her system's libraries. But she wouldn't abandon him, not if she could help it. She thought he was still alive, but in some kind of comatose state. If he regained consciousness, he might order her to leave without him. And it would be wise, but she did not think there was any chance he'd get help in time then. Pyrrha. A series of flashes in the corner of her eye were caught by her system. "Sens," she said. He couldn't understand it, but at least he'd hear the sound. His kind weren't deaf, they just didn't use verbal communication. His polyps were limply coming out of their holes. When he'd taken the hit, they'd all retreated in so deeply to his rocky shell that they were invisible. His lights flashed again. "You should leave me," he said. Her system translated it in a very neutral voice, but his words came slower than normal, and that worried her. "I'm not," she said, reaching a new corridor and shoving the sensor around. Stopping both of their weights with her legs was hard, but she managed it. No one down here. She tried to pick one of the shortest paths she could, but still keep in some randomness. After those 3 guards failed to report back in, she expected more squads to get dispatched. Their dirty secret had been uncovered. "I need to get into water," Sens flashed. "I stayed inside as long as I could, but the air ran out. I don't have that long." "Don't worry, we're going to make it," she said, dragging him around the corner. "We're not that far." Without a translation unit, he wouldn't understand, but perhaps he'd get the feeling. She just hoped he would try to hold on. But his polyps looked bad. They could not stay upright and flopped over limply. Was it from weakness or from being out of water? There was an opening here, just a hole in the wall half filled with heavy piping. Peering out, she saw nothing and began to pull Sens out. Maybe she should look for a water tap. It surely wouldn't be sufficient, but maybe it'd buy him some more time. She noticed the shooter just before he fired and jerked herself back. His shot would have taken her head off if she'd not seen it and moved. "Down!" she yelled, shoving Sens back behind the pipes. "We've got your other routes cut off," a male human called. "Surrender now!" She unslung the rifle. She wasn't about to give up. There might still be a way out. Peering down the hall, she couldn't tell if anyone was down there. If they had been, then they'd have them surrounded with no cover at all. "You are in violation of intergalactic law," she called back. "Summon my parent ship immediately. We have an injured being here." "You don't get to make demands," the man yelled. "Come out immediately, or we'll not be taking you alive." The last shot had been aimed to kill her, so she didn't figure there was any truth in his offer of clemency. Sounds came from the hall behind them, and she realized that the talking had just been a distraction. If they came around that corner, they'd be without any cover at all. She slammed the butt of her rifle into a control panel. Every panel like this contained a glass tube that would break in a depressurization event. A simple and foolproof way to make sure pressure seal doors would activate even if most other systems failed. The door slammed shut quickly, shaking the floor. It would take them a while to force a door open or convince the system that there had been no depressurization. At least in this kind of place, she figured it would. Unfortunately, she realized too late that it triggered the door down the hall as well. They were trapped. "Put your weapon down and step out slowly. Hands up." She wouldn't do that. If she was lucky, these men might be recruits, and she could scare them off. They'd have her in their sights and would be able to gun her down if she peeked. She needed an advantage. Taking the sensor she'd been using, she set her system to overload every piece in it at once. It was far too much heat for the device to run them all. There was a component in the sensor she knew from experience would produce quite an uncomfortably bright flash when it overheated. She chucked it out the gap. Shots came in return, confirming her suspicions. But none of the bullets hit the tiny sensor, and a moment later, bang. It burst, and while it wasn't the best cover, she leaned out and squeezed the trigger on her rifle. A burst of rounds fired out, not hitting them, but hitting close enough to send some ducking. Others, she saw, had recoiled. The bright flash had been worse through their scopes, enough to stun them. But then she realized just how many there were. She ducked back just as return fire came, flinching as round after round hit the piping behind her. But the metal was thick, and only fools used rounds that could punch through things on a ship or station. At least a dozen, she figured. Only about 4 times as many as she'd first thought. "Shit," she said. "Pyrrha," Sens flashed. "Just stay down," she signaled, waving him down and hoping he'd not try to go out. Not try to do something stupidly brave again. "Pyrrha, I just want to say how sorry I am." He was still going. She tried to wave him down again. This was not the moment for him to be feeling bad for getting injured. She had to figure out something, and quickly. I know you threw your singing stone away, he said. That caught her off guard. Wait, what? I'm sorry. I looked up more after we spoke on the ship. I didn't know how bad it was for your people, what it meant for you to have them, how hard it was. Their translators always did an incredible job of sharing the feeling behind words, reading inflections and tones and context, to try and impart the most accurate portrayal of what a being was saying. She didn't know how Sens's kind even displayed emotions like sadness. In his current state, it was hard for him to even talk, and yet he was trying so hard to impart the emotions to his words. She'd never heard his voice more full of sorrow. It's all gone, he continued. Almost all of your people killed, your language and culture eradicated, and you had to throw it away. Pyrrha didn't know what to say. She didn't know how she could possibly let herself delve into the emotions that moved him so much now. Even at the best of times, they were something she was scared to consider. But it meant enough to him to bring up when he was, in all likelihood, dying. Kneeling, she reached out a hand and touched the mechanical hand at the end of his arm. The fingers closed around her hand gently. I'll get us out of this, she told him softly. Her voice cracked all the same. Now she just had to figure out how. Hey, who are you? She heard a human shout. Someone else was out there. 6 guns pointed to Kel, while another 6 kept their sights trained on the doorway. Identify yourself immediately, a man barked. Half a dozen other voices were screaming orders. Kel ignored them all. I am Ambassador Kel from the Sapient Union. Kel's voice did not sound as it normally did. A slip of something strange, inhuman, came into the tones. And the men facing the ambassador caught it. To a man, those present felt fear enter their hearts. Something in them was triggered by what the being before them had just let slip. Its voice, the kind of voice that it would have used in ages past to cry out as it hunted life like theirs. From the simplest bacteria to humanity itself, Chagas had preyed upon them. Instinct existed in all such life to fear their sound. One man, the oldest, spoke. His voice trembled, but he did a good job of keeping his strength. I don't care who you are. Get out of here. But he made no move to force the issue. Am I to take it, then, that you will try to keep me from taking my compatriots out of here? Kel asked. The voice was simple, quiet, but more of the truth of what it was slipped into its voice. Part of Kel wanted them to listen, but they didn't. These are my prisoners. Get out of here before I shoot, the man yelled. He was nearly to the breaking point, his hands shaking. At any moment, he'd let off a shot on accident. Kel smiled. Good. Pyrrha heard shouts, but she couldn't make out the one voice. There was something strange about it, but she couldn't tell what. It just sounded off. Then the screams started, and the shooting came right after. There were no controlled bursts, just full auto. The screams were short, agonized. She heard crashes and impacts so loud that she could hear the bones breaking. An object came flying through the gap, and she threw herself back, letting out a sound that was half scream and half battle cry. It was a human body, tumbling like a rag doll. It was flying like it had been shot from a cannon, hitting the wall with a sickening sound that was at once a splat and the shattering of bone. The body rebounded, its momentum so great that it flew back out. She could peer carefully out at it, where it had slid to a stop, 4 meters back into the other room. The man was dead, there could be no doubt. The force had mangled his body so much it was barely recognizable as a human. She had seen bodies fly like that before, in industrial accidents when vehicles or heavy machinery went awry. But it was never less shocking to see, and she could not account for what could have done it. Had there even been industrial equipment out there? Footsteps approached, and Pierre tried to heft the rifle against whatever was now coming after them. Kel leaned between the pipes. The ambassador's face was perfectly calm, but there was no hiding the blood that was splattered across it. Red blood. Human blood. We must return to the ship, it said. Looking down to Sens, Kel leaned over and took the being, moving the coral like he weighed nothing. Pyrrha couldn't make words, but nodded. Kel left, pulling Sens with him. Pierce stepped out and saw the carnage, what was left of the dozen men that had been out here. Her eyes were drawn to the ambassador. There was a smile on its face. "What the fuck are you telling me?" Nekteed screamed at the image of his security chief. Hakrem did not even blink. "The security team I dispatched to check on the first team are all dead, Governor. You said that the Coral was out of its suit, badly wounded, and probably dying. Are you telling me that 2 Xenos, one of them dying, killed a dozen men?" "We see some signs of a firefight, but that's not what killed the men," Rem replied evenly. "Then what did?" Fear stabbed into his chest, making it tighten painfully. His head felt like it was swimming. "We're not sure, but it appears that blunt trauma and cervical fractures were responsible for their deaths." "What?" the governor demanded. The words weren't too big for him, but in his current state, he couldn't parse that out. "Crushed or broken necks," Rem clarified. Something in his words sounded tired, as if he was explaining this to a child. "The squad leader was nearly decapitated. That is, his head was almost removed." Nekteed felt ready to explode on the man. How dare he? But the man continued before Nek could get his thoughts in order. "I understand this is alarming news, Governor, but do not be concerned. I have a plan that will solve these issues. This scene is fresh, and I don't believe they have reached their ship yet. I need you to contact the Captain Mayor and keep him and his people calm. Get them to lower their guard. Promise whatever you have to. We don't need long." Nek's eyes narrowed. "What's your plan?" "It's better if you don't know, Governor." Rem's expression did not change, but the way he tilted his head back made it seem mocking. With a great effort, fueled by his own fear, Nek nodded. "I'll keep them busy." Rem cut the line. Nekteed slammed his fist into the console. Once, then again and again. Everything was going out of his control. When he'd first hired Hakrem, the man had seemed perfect. Not only good with a gun and administration, but he'd known people all over the outer colonies, including his shadowy contacts. He had brokered the deal for the cloning equipment and only cared about money, which meant his motives were at least clear. But now the man had his own agenda, it was obvious. And he was hiding things, always a bad sign. But what could he do? He was in up to his neck. Even if he'd never gotten to this crazy cloning plan, he'd still just be the leader of a dying colony with no hope of a future. Any day, he knew, Ban and his cutthroats and old Vitriol would come in here and take over, and bring his head back to his cousin. His own blood, his own ancestry tracing back to the fucking idiot prophet that had brought them to this fucking shitty system had marked him for life. And now they involved these SU officers. If they died, if word got back, that would be it. No more external trade, at best. The possibility that they'd come in with more ships than he had people and just arrest him and send him off to some penal colony was also possible. And there, he thought, it'd be even easier for Ban to kill him. If they did that. In a moment of clarity, he realized he had no idea what they did with prisoners. He'd never been outside of the system, and everything he knew about the SU presented them as naive, soft, but possessing overwhelming ships and people when they were angry. It was how they'd beaten the Aina, beaten the Lataran, sheer numbers. None of the serials ever showed what they did with their prisoners, though. For all he knew, they ground them up into nutrient paste for their algae vats. A dull, throbbing pain burned in his hand, and he realized he'd probably fractured a bone with his rampage. He had to calm down. There were still ways to salvage this, and right now, he had no choice but to trust Hakrem. Taking a few moments to compose himself, Nek dialed up the SU ship. "Governor Nekteed, calling for Captain Mayor Brooks," he said. A moment later, the captain appeared. "Governor, have you had any word about my missing people?" So they hadn't gotten back yet, just as Rem had said. "We found some sign of them, Captain. They've wandered deep into the asteroid. We have a lot of areas that are drilled, but not yet occupied." The captain's face tightened. "Even so, it's been almost 24 hours, Governor. I refuse to believe that your people are this incapable." Anger spiked in him, but the governor tried to keep his words soothing. "As I said, it's a big asteroid. We believe in the individual's rights here, Captain. If people want to mine on their own, so long as they have the permits, they can do it. We haven't even mapped it all out. Some of his anger squeezed out. But I have to ask, what were your people doing wandering so far? We have warnings posted all over the place about the dangers of getting lost. Brooks hesitated, just a moment, but Neck caught it. I'm not sure, but yesterday for a time we detected a second homing signal that matched that of our craft, coming from within the colony. It could have been used to lure my people away from the ship. I didn't hear anything about that, Neck said, feeling thrown on the defensive again. But if it did happen, then it must have been an accident. People got excited about your arrival, probably just trying to emulate the outsider. He grimaced. It's one of the downsides of being isolated. People start to think everything foreign is better. I'd like a full investigation into that, Brooks said. I should think you would, too. If it's one of the enemies from the other colonies you've spoken of, this would be a chance to find them. Ah, that's a good point, Neck replied. You've got yourself a good head there, Captain Mayor. Brooks didn't seem to even take in the compliment. Meanwhile, Governor, I'd like to continue our discussions about Apollonia Nor. I'd like to see a full report of your evidence against her. Oh, Neck took a moment to consider. He hadn't really formalized anything about the woman into a report. It wasn't the sort of detail he generally bothered to track. I've been considering that, Captain Mayor. I've decided that, if you're willing to take her off the colony, I'll drop the charges. Herm had said to get the captain to let his guard down, hadn't he? That's very generous of you, Brooks replied. But you seemed convinced she had murdered the former head of security. Why just drop the charges? Captain Mayor, you wanted her. I want her gone. It's no matter to me if it's warm or cold. Will you take her? Yes, Brooks replied. But I'd still like to know what evidence you have of her killing your former security chief. Just motive and her gifts, as you like to call them. She and the old chief never got along. Violently so. That's it? Brooks asked. Yes, Neck hissed, his patience straining. Besides, I want to show you I'm willing to work with you, Captain. Have you considered my requests? Yes, Brooks replied. But he did not elaborate. If you do this, Governor, I'll consider it an act of good faith and it will reflect well upon you. This, and having my people returned unharmed. I'm glad to hear that, Nex said, giving his best smile. I'll do everything in my power. You have my word. Brooks didn't smile back as he ended the call.